Whenever you're ready to go for it.
Thank you. We don't have any questions. We're good to start.
Nope, we don't have any questions either. I'm sorry, just a second. Let me turn on some lights. Okay. My name is Kira Chatwin, and I'll be the first speaker for the affirmative in today's round. Okay, 7 minutes. Anybody not ready? My time will begin now. I strongly affirm the resolution that China's zero COVID policy is a mistake. Now, this is going to be a fact round. A couple of observations. First is that this is a fact round where this is a statement, which means we're either affirming that this is true or the neg is going to come up and try to prove that this is false. And mistake essentially just means do more harm than good. So if something does more harm than good, then it's a mistake. And we're going to argue that China's zero COVID policy is going to do more harm than good, which is why it is a mistake. Second observation here is that this is in the present tense, which indicates that we're considering the situation right now. It is a mistake right now, not that it was in the past. Perhaps it was useful in the past, but right now in today's current world, it is a mistake. And third is just a quick definition of China's zero COVID policy. It refers to China's extremely harsh COVID regulations to meet its zero COVID infection target, including lockdowns, border closures, stay-at-home orders, among other policies. So essentially, their target is zero COVID infections, and they're going to achieve that through any means possible. A couple of background points. First is that China's policy was effective in the past, but with declining infection rates and around 90% of the population already vaccinated, zero COVID is no longer proving to be a worthwhile strategy. Is that mutations are inevitable? Just look at Omicron variants that are increasingly transmissible, and viruses naturally change and adapt. This indicates that a zero COVID policy would be never ending, and at the point where COVID cannot be fully eradicated, probably would not contribute much. Second is that we aren't defending a massive reopening or even necessarily a huge reopening on any scale at all. We're simply saying that the policy of shutting everything down in the instance of one case is not a good thing. And is that Taiwan is also moving away from a zero COVID policy. So there is this movement in the status quo that it's just not going so well. Now, our first contention or reason why this is true is that of economic downturn in the status quo, because we see that China's policy of zero COVID is directly contributing to a significant amount of economic downturn. There's a couple of warrants for this. First is that shutdowns are causing significant harm to the Chinese economy. A is that shutting down cities means that China can no longer conduct basic operations like production. This makes sense. If you're imposing a massive lockdown restriction on a city, you can no longer manufacture. Your people aren't allowed to leave their homes, let alone go to businesses and do their work, which indicates that a massive amount of economic production is decreased. B is that this is directly slowing their economy, as China's economic growth is expected to slow to 1.6% this year, which is the lowest in more than 4 decades, which indicates that there's been a massive projected economic loss because of this policy. Second is that decreased economic growth in China is also causing a mass exodus of companies and important producers willing to operate in China. A is that companies like Samsung, Hasbro, Apple, Nintendo, and GoPro have already moved large parts of their supply chain outside of China, reducing economic activity and decreasing the availability of consumer goods. B is that this is not just isolated to big companies. Small companies are closing too, as they can no longer afford to complete business in a world in which their ability to actually engage in business is so unpredictable. So we see that estimates show that more than 4.5 million small businesses closed in 2020 and was likely higher in 2021. Third is we see that shutdowns are also impacting China's ability to trade with other nations. Is that ports get shut down because of small amounts of COVID infections. Just look to Meishan, Yantian, Zhoushan. They all got shut down because of minor COVID outbreaks that led to massive disruptions in supply chain and destroyed economic activity. This causes traffic jams of huge container ships and backlogs that eventually cause congestion even elsewhere, as ships got rerouted and had to no longer go through China or be able to actually trade at the ports where they were supposed to, which jams like the entire global system of trade. B is that independently shipping costs are increasing because shipments are becoming less possible due to the amount of shutdowns, and trade is simply just less feasible. For example, the cost to ship a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Los Angeles, one of the world's busiest lanes, has soared to $10,000, which is nearly 6 times the rate before the pandemic, because we see that there's simply this instability in how this shipping and how this trade gets conducted. And for this, we see that this is raising the cost for consumers because they no longer have stable access to goods that they need to buy for their daily life. The inability to trade has led to massive increases in prices. Just look how vegetable prices rose 17% in September, for example, because food resources are just harder to come by. There's a couple of impacts to this. First is that of poverty, because we see that people can no longer afford their basic needs, and they can no longer afford to spend money on the economy as prices start to rise and trade diminishes. Second is that of jobs overall. Decreasing industry saw a 20% drop in job opportunities in October, something that is expected to continue, which means that there's less opportunities for growth overall. And third is that of the economy, because we see decreased economic growth, which is leading to decreased small businesses, entrepreneurship, which is all important to things like innovation, to things like creating solutions to the new problems of today's world. Our second contention is going to be that of health, because we see that a zero COVID policy actually detracts from health resources in a couple ways. First is that we see that zero COVID is resulting in unbalanced medical attention. Is that many hospitals are forcibly required to divert the majority of their budget into COVID-related treatment, which is unfeasible in the long run, because you can't simply spend all of your money on a pandemic that is unfortunately probably going to last a while. B is that moreover, medical workers are being devoted to one concentrated area to deal with the outbreak, as more than 38,000 medical workers have been sent to Shanghai from elsewhere to deal with the outbreak, which is taking resources from other hospitals that need it. And second is that disproportionate medical attention and staff is actually hurting cities across China. A is that this has resulted in long wait times and expensive treatments for patients. Look to how a woman actually lost her baby because she couldn't get adequate treatment in time because all of the resources were devoted to COVID patients that maybe didn't even have serious cases. B is that this is also bad for dealing with COVID overall, because several healthcare workers say the hospitals that they work at are running short of staff because so many people are being moved away when their city is in an outbreak. The thing is, when China decides to redivert resources to whoever has the biggest outbreak at the time, or whoever they decide needs to be shut down right then and there, it means that resources are taken away from other areas of the country that actually need those resources to contain maybe the smaller amounts of outbreaks, which on net leads to greater spread of the pandemic, because this diversion of resources is allowing this greater spread to happen and allowing the virus to grow in those places in which it otherwise wouldn't, because those medical resources would be there to check back. So the impacts of this are twofold. First is that we see the pandemic gets elongated because these disproportionate allocation of resources means that the pandemic spreads. But second is going to be that of day-to-day medical care. People need medical care for reasons other than COVID-19. There's a lot of people who aren't being that affected seriously by things like Omicron that maybe are less deadly but are more transmissible, which is why we see that other people who are facing deadly illnesses, who are facing problems that could actually cause direct harm to them, need that medical attention more. Which is why at the end of the day, you're going to be voting affirmative. Thank you.
Okay, after I move up, I'll begin with a couple of refutes on the observations at the top, and then go into 2 negation contentions, and then affirmative case in order. My time starts now. We strongly negate the resolution. First, on the observations, we agree that this is a fact round. However, we'd like to add an observation here that they burden the negations to prove that the policy is not a mistake. Therefore, we can also prove that it could be neutral if the goods or the harms equals the goods, and we'll be proving why it's good too, why the goods outweigh the harms. In addition, on their first observation, on their background about how declining infections, therefore, is no longer good, and we have to consider the present because of the topic's wording. First response here is that we have to consider precedent of what has happened in the past, because the only reason why we're at lower cases right now is because of the zero COVID policy, which shows that it's effective and can continue improving for the future. Second response here is that vaccines are currently being made to counter mutations, which means that COVID can end, and the effects of mutations can be ended or decreased and mitigated, and they're not inevitable. Look to the fact that vaccines right now are like for Pfizer that were like effective against the original like Delta variant is also more effective towards Omicron and other variants as well. And in addition, they talk about how 90% of the population is vaccinated. That's all still really bad because China has uniquely a really large population. So that 10% of China's unvaccinated population could be the population of an entire country, right? So we still need to solve that problem by continuing the COVID-19 policy. Third response here is that China has already survived with the lowest deaths for 20 months. So even if the policy is never ending, it's still better because we save lives in the long term. And fourth response here on their thing about policy of shutting everything is bad, the Chinese government will still pass shutdown laws in a post-zero COVID-19 policy world to contain cases after, which will probably be worse for the economy. Now let's go into the first observation on the negative, which is that China has rolled out its well-worn methods for controlling the disease, placing specifically like their methods are placing tens of millions of residents under some form of lockdown, shutting down factories, constructing makeshift hospitals to isolate cases, and rounding up close contacts of cases for surveillance or quarantine. So let's go into the first contention, which is that it saves lives. China's management of COVID-19 has to date prevented 200 million infections and 3 million deaths. Number two is that China has undertaken massive efforts to protect its people from the virus, pulling off what's been called the largest vaccination campaign in history, developing vaccines at record speed and doling out 2.8 billion doses domestically in 2021 alone. Number three is that as one of the last countries to follow a COVID-19 policy, the world's most populous nation has lost fewer than 6,000 of its 1.4 billion people to COVID-19, while expanding its economy by 8.1% in 2021 and registering a total record trade surplus. So the reasons why this is effective and why it's happening is because number one, it prevents population mingling, specifically for smaller towns which don't have the infrastructure to like accommodate a lot of COVID-19 cases. Its main goal is prevention, ensuring that COVID-19 cases don't start or spread at all in the first place. So that's essentially why isolation and lockdowns are effective and occurring right now because of China's large population. Because travel to and from China from foreigners and like foreign countries is strictly limited, that's also effective because it places restrictions on internal movement and decreases the like speed and spread of COVID-19. Secondly, the isolations and quarantines are especially effective because they're at centralized facilities, which means that once someone has COVID, it's not going to spread as fast to other places. And targeted area lockdowns are also good because of the specific quarantine period. So the impacts are that the zero case policy could have saved an estimated 1 million more lives in the future as well. So we can see that because of these lockdowns, it just directly saves lives. And it's also a high magnitude impact because one COVID case could lead to the spread to more than 10 people because of China's high population density. Now let's go into the second contention, which is infrastructure. So what is happening right now? Well, by June 2021, mainland China constructed more than 1,600 online hospitals with more than 239 million users, providing a solid foundation for the rapid development of online healthcare services due to its zero COVID policy. Number two is that more than 8,400 medical institutes in the country can conduct nucleic acid tests on a combined total of 12.55 million samples a day. When a case is found, citywide and sometimes province-wide lockdowns are implemented, with residents only allowed out once every 2 days to buy groceries and other essentials. Number three is that by 2021, 970,000 community hospitals had been established in mainland China, employing more than 3 million healthcare workers. So we can see the reasons why this is good. Number one is that it increases the amount of medical infrastructure, like the amount of hospitals, the amount of tests that are available, which is a long-term impact because if there are any other outbreaks that are not COVID-19 in the long term, it's going to be really helpful because it gets resources faster and increases access to healthcare to a lot more people. Number two is that this increases the amount of healthcare workers who are being employed, right? Because there's more hospitals being established, more people are going to be needed to run those hospitals, which is good because it prevents further overload in the long term. And number three is that when we have more infrastructure in place, like more manpower, more regulations to actually enforce the lockdowns, that's really good because to prevent like further outbreaks in the future as well, saving lives in the long term. So now let's move on to the affirmative case. On their first contention about economic downturn, they first talk about how there's the decreased production because of the shutdown. Three responses here. First, a lot of companies have required their workers or employees to live on site, such as GM, which just is a way for companies to continue production and still meet the quotas and increase exports. Second response here is that the majority of Chinese companies, especially tech companies, allow workers to work at home. So a huge part of the Chinese tech sector and startup sector is still growing right now, which is a huge reason why it has recorded the record trade surplus right now. Number three is that countries are not going to leave. They talk about how ports shutting down are going to cause countries to move outside because China's Chinese workers have a uniquely low wage. So that's a unique reason that incentivizes companies to stay in China in the long term, no matter how bad COVID gets. Okay, so on their second contention about health, they talk about how there's unbalanced medical attention because it's concentrated. First response here is that the lockdown uniquely benefits smaller towns because of the fact that if it's concentrated in one area in smaller towns, they don't have the infrastructure necessary because they don't have the funding necessary to accommodate their population. Therefore, the lockdown is the only way to solve. Second response here is that the unbalanced medical attention is non-unique, is actually going to be worse in the affirmative world because of that infrastructure point. Secondly, they talk about how there's longer wait times because of the diversion of resources. First response here is that this is actually a turn to the opposition side, because if we reopen, if we stop that lockdown and isolation policy, there's going to be more cases, which means that there's going to be even more people streaming into the hospitals. And because of the lack of resources to accommodate China's large population, there's going to be a lower quality of resources for each person. There's going to be less people who get the service, leading to even longer wait times. And second response here is that it's actually good that resources are being allocated to the places where they need it the most, because of the fact that if they're all concentrated in one area, we can see that China's land is spread out over a really large area, so that the smaller towns on the borders or farther away from urban areas will not get the resources they need, which means the people, especially in rural areas where there's already bad infrastructure in place, they're not going to be able to get the service they need, leading to even more deaths. Thank you, and for all these reasons, strongly urge negation ballot.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my order is going to be the I'll go an overview, the affirmative, and then affirmative in order, and then the negative. Okay. The only way to curb the pandemic is through a prospering economy, because by that, only through a strong economy can you spur innovation, can you open channels of talk with foreign nations, and provide the citizens and the city governments the financial means to provide COVID treatment in the first place. And at the point where a massive shutdown has resulted in a high contraction of the Chinese economy, the zero COVID policy is a huge mistake. Let's go on to the first contention. Now, they have three responses here. Number one, they say companies require workers to live on site. They say the majority of companies allow workers to work at home. However, it's important to know that these companies are for workers who are probably high skilled and they're able to work offline. But for workers who need to be in person, this is simply just not the case. Then they talk about how companies won't leave, but this is not true because companies have already left. Just look to how Samsung and Apple are diverting their supply chain away from China, meaning that there's less trade flowing through Chinese ports and there's less economic activity happening overall. But even if you don't buy that, we can see that uniquely small businesses are decreasing. Look to how 4.5 million small businesses have closed in 2020, and the number is likely higher in 2021. And if this is going to continue, it's going to especially due to the more and more mutations happening, this number is just going to keep on going because businesses are going to be forced to shut down when they see one case of mutation happening in their town. We will also see that this is we can also see that this is causing increased shipment costs because there's again less trade flowing through, meaning that consumer prices are also rising, which means that people can't afford basic necessities like food and things to keep them alive apart from COVID treatment. And we see these impacts are significant. Number one, we see that when people can't afford food and when people can't afford treatment in the first place, that means they can't even get the that means they're left in the open, like that means they're more vulnerable to COVID itself, and they're more vulnerable to infection. Secondly, we see that without the economic prosperity, without trade, cities won't get the revenue, like governments won't get the revenue they need to fund these public health programs in the first place. Meaning, we would argue that economic activity is a prerequisite to actually mitigating the impacts of COVID. Let's go into the second contention of health. The overview here is that only ending zero COVID ensures a balanced allocation of resources for two reasons. Number one, the allocation of workers, because now the government is not going to be able to say, oh, you're going to have to go to this place because this is where the outbreak is, when you're when they're like by ignoring like other districts. Secondly is wait times. This policy requires COVID treatments that come in first, but not even the serious COVID treatments, just COVID treatments itself. We're not saying that like, oh, like if this person is on a life or death situation, that they shouldn't get COVID treatment. But we're saying that in the case of mild COVID infections, it should not be placed first from people who are per se having a baby, for people who are having like another extremely contagious disease. Now on to more of the what the negation talks about. Number one, they say that lockdowns are benefiting smaller towns. This is not true. The medical workers from these smaller towns are the people who are diverted away to bigger towns like Shanghai to deal with the outbreak there, when in fact they're leaving them vulnerable when the smaller towns see an outbreak. Meaning that you simply just don't solve the pandemic at the point where maybe you curb the infection in one area, but you're just letting all these other infections spring up in other areas because there's simply not enough resources in those areas because they're all diverted in that one single place. Secondly, they talk about how it's going to be worse because of infrastructure. Number one, the infrastructure they talk about is like high technology. It probably requires like a lot of funding that smaller cities simply don't have. And secondly, we will argue that the infrastructure is still going to remain even if we like don't continue with the zero COVID policy. Then they have a few other responses here. Number one, they talk about how like there's going to be if we reopen, there's going to be more cases and less like resources. However, we're not advocating for full reopening. We're just saying that we shouldn't be like forcing every city into lockdown when there's a single mutation, or when there's single infection. We shouldn't be diverting all of our resources into one single place, which is what these zero COVID policy is doing right now. Then we will argue that they say that it's good that resources are allocated where they need it the most, but we will argue that like, these resources aren't necessarily like all the you can't justify diverting like every single medical worker to one area just to solve this one temporary like spike in cases, like when you're neglecting all the rest. Let's go on to the first net contention. Well, even if they prove that zero COVID policy has worked in the past, they fail to understand why it's working now and why it is still necessary. They say that lower cases now mean it's effective, but this is not true, especially in the case of Omicron. Look to how, even though Hong Kong was in zero COVID policy, because of Omicron, they've recorded more than 16,000 cases so far in this year, which means that because of the increased transmissibility of mutations, shutdowns are simply not effective. Secondly, in fact, this is going to be a term, we will argue that the policy of admitting every positive case to the hospital creates huge backlog. Look to how more than 10,000 COVID patients are waiting for hospital treatment or isolation. And thirdly, especially when you're diverting resources towards high density populations, COVID just keeps spreading in all those small cities, which means that you inherently just cannot stop the spread. Then they talk about how vaccines are not enough. Two responses here. Number one is that US has high vaccination rates and they're able to like curb like Omicron. But even if you don't buy like the US is not a good example. We see that Denmark, Germany, and other European countries like Australia have also achieved strong immunity because they used vaccines. They made decisions about where to impose lockdowns instead of making the entire country shut down. And it shows like that like absence. Like countries are able to contain COVID absent a zero COVID policy. Then they talk about how China has had the largest vaccination campaign in history. This is a reason for why they will be okay if they are not in a complete shutdown, because their vaccination campaign is succeeding and people are able to get boosters, they're able to get vaccinated in the first place. They say that the main goal is prevention, but the fact is that prevention is not plausible right now at the point where mutations and transmissions are increasing, and the point where like basically shutdowns are no longer effective in containing such spread. Then on their impacts, they talk about how there's going to be like millions of lives being saved, but they ignore the fact that COVID is going to be like the flu. So unfortunately, yes, people are going to still die of COVID. But the thing is that like there's a necessity to be able to adapt to COVID, like how we respond to the flu. It's gonna be here to stay, but like forcing everyone to lock down when COVID is when you can't even stop the COVID spread, you can't solve the root cause of COVID, just inherently is not viable. Let's go on to the second contention of infrastructure. There's no reason why infrastructure would suddenly disappear when the policy is waned out or it disappears. We say that these online healthcare services are probably just restricted to high-income areas with higher technological access, which leave the lower-income communities who are already very vulnerable, like even more vulnerable, which means that like the only way to improve like health in these low-income cities is funding. They need revenue. This can only happen through economic activity, through their small businesses opening back up, which we have not seen happening under the zero COVID policy. In fact, we're seeing it getting worse. We're seeing the situation being exasperated. They talk about how medical institutes can now conduct DNA tests and that like there are thousands of community hospitals. Just look to how Taiwan is still investing in this kind of infrastructure despite ending COVID. We will argue that this infrastructure is not unique to the zero COVID policy. The zero COVID policy is basically a massive draconian lockdown, which is not what these services entail or necessarily need. For all those reasons, I strongly urge a vote for negation. Oh, affirmative, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to be starting off with an overview, going into some weighing, then going over the negatives case in order and then the affirmatives case. Are there any questions before I begin? No? My time starts now. At the point in which the affirmative concedes that in China, number one, infrastructure has been historically weak, and number two, 10% of the population is unvaccinated, they concede the fact that if we did not have a zero COVID policy in place, more than 3 million people would have already died. At this point, and to the point of which we can see that like people dying is worse for the economy, but also to the point of which like 230 million cases being spreaded is probably worse for the economy. We're winning today's debate because saving lives saves the economy inherently. Let's go into some top case weighing. Number one, judges, you're going to be weighing the lives of the economy for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that lives are irreversible. The economy isn't. We see that like economic recessions come and go, lives do not. Second of all, we see that lives are the internal link to the economy because each person, like people actually need to be alive in order to help the economy. But third of all, in the case of COVID specifically, lives are like businesses do not open if there's a risk of more people like getting COVID cases. So the affirmative with the affirmative concedes a lot of our analysis that tells you that because we've had such low cases, that's why there's been business that has still been able to keep on going in the first place. But with that, let's move on to the negatives case on the observations. First of all, extensively arguing that the burden of the negative is only to prove that this policy is not a mistake. We're going to go one step further and prove that like the zero COVID policy is actually a good thing. But if we can prove that it's not a mistake, then we already win. On the background, the first argument that we say is that you have to consider precedent. The opponents say this is just not true because of the fact there's Omicron happening right now. Number one, look to the fact that like to the point at which the zero COVID policy has already withstood other mutations such as Delta over the past 20 months, that probably means that it's also going to survive this mutation. Second of all, look at the fact that they bring up evidence on Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not part of China. But third of all, look to the fact that we're going to see that when you have a backlog of cases, it's just going to get worse. On the second argument that we read to you about like vaccines right now are able to counter mutations, that's going to be key in this debate, extend that. And third of all, on an argument that tells you that 10% of China is unvaccinated, and that's the equivalent of an entire country, that goes cold conceding. That's really important. So when the opponents tell you or try to say that, okay, China has very high vaccination rates, it's not high enough and China needs to be higher. But to the point at which a country with that many people, over 2 billion people, has been able to maintain such a low COVID case rate, that probably means that it's going to be good for two reasons. Number one, because it helps our economy uniquely. But number two, in a world where it's easier for COVID to spread and they've made it spread even less, that probably shows you that the success of the zero COVID policy has been even higher. Okay. All right. Then now let's go on to the negatives case. On our first contention about saves lives, on the uniqueness level, judges, the most important thing by here is that all these infections and all these deaths would have happened if it were not for the zero COVID policy, this is something that the affirmative fundamentally concedes. Look at the fact that 200 million infections have been prevented already, and 3 million deaths have already been prevented. This is probably going to be key, not only because we're winning on like the weighing mechanism here, because of the fact that we're saving lives and we've already proved lives are more important than the economy, but second of all, because this is actually going to be better for the economy, as I can prove later. The only thing that the opponents say here is that, okay, because we've had 2.8 billion domestic doses rolled out, that probably means that the policy has succeeded, but that's not true, because we're telling you that China actually needs a lot more has 10% of the population still like unvaccinated. And we tell you that 200 million infections would have happened if it were not for the policy. But also look at the fact that you're only able to like actually distribute these many doses in a zero COVID world because you're able to track down where the individual people are and make sure that they are vaccinated. Vaccinations inherently require tracking. But on our third Renegus argument, right, extend the fact that the Chinese economy faced an 8.1% expansion last year compared to the global average. This is going to be key here, judges, because last year, pretty much every country lost money because COVID was happening. But compared to the overall world, because of the fact that China actually had less cases comparatively, it was still able to grow its economy as a whole. Again, every economy probably retracted. This is going to be key because compared to the world, it was able to get an advantage. Like, okay, even if China was perfect, it still would have lost money because other countries, such as the United States, which they trade in, were already losing productions, which means that China gets less imports from the United States inherently, which is probably a unique reason as to why they weren't doing as well. Again, they concede the fact that like we're actually preventing population movement, and we're also there's also isolation available at centralized facilities, and that's going to be key. But also extend the fact that quarantine periods have already been reduced. On our second contention about infrastructure, the overview of this contention is that at the point of which these unique infrastructure plans only started in a world of zero COVID policy, we can see that this new infrastructure would not have been built if zero COVID policy was not started. What does this mean? This means a couple of things. First of all, this means that zero COVID policy is the internal link to actually solving for not only the COVID crisis, but also the other healthcare crises that are happening right now, such as other diseases, which means that overall in the long term, we're actually able to get treatment for even other sorts of types of illnesses that the opponents talk about. But second of all, look to the fact that we tell you that this unique infrastructure was popped into smaller communities, right? Like we're telling you that they say that we're diverting resources. That's just not true. These 1.6 million hospitals were built throughout the region, and even if they were going into even if they were only in rich regions before, this probably means that they were actually going to the poor regions this time around, which means that this actually creates a new healthcare sector in all of these poor communities, which is the only thing that's actually being done to help these poor communities. But third of all, judges, in order to look at how effective zero COVID policy really was in this region, you have to imagine a world in which we did not have zero COVID policy. Do you really think that the Chinese government would have prioritized these poor regions if COVID was spreading rampant? If these 200 million cases were actually in the region, these lower income communities without infrastructure would have been the ones that would have been harmed first. And that probably means that these 1.6 million hospitals are with 239 million users are helping poor communities. And this is a unique impact that only negative can access. The president here that we already accessed it. Again, look at the fact that 3 million healthcare workers were able to get jobs afterwards, and extend the fact that there's been 970,000 community hospitals. Basically, we would have had a completely worse situation if we didn't have zero COVID, because of the fact that weak infrastructure in China means that if COVID was spread, there would have been even worse of a backlog and even worse of an overcrowding within these hospitals. On the affirmative first contention about economic downturn. The first argument here is that less COVID cases actually helps for the economy. We're winning this on logic. First of all, when you have less COVID cases, more people can actually work because they're not sick. Second of all, businesses can open when they don't have to risk getting cases. Third of all, look to the fact that online shipping businesses are still happening right now. Even if people have to stay at home, or even if businesses are less, we see that online shipping is something that works in China because of the fact that they can deliver their goods right now because the people that are actually shipping out these goods do not have COVID. This analysis is more probable and just makes a lot more sense overall. Okay, again, the economy can still reopen in the long term if zero COVID is continued right now. We're saying that it's necessary right now since the job is not done, which means that it can end in 5 to 10 years down the line. Then when they're talking about people move to Shanghai to curb in one area, this is not diversion. This is allocated efficiency overall. Okay, on the other things that the opponents say is that there was GM workers that were high skilled, but again, extend the fact that there was 6.1% expansion globally. That's probably going to be key here. Again, on mild COVID cases, extend the backlog argument. On our second argument about health, over here is that they concede that more cases spread, which means that when they talk about not enough resources, number one, look to the fact that like poor communities are not going to be prioritized in a world where COVID was allowed to spread, but also extend the fact that there was unique infrastructure built in order to actually help it, which means that the backlog argument gets turned on the affirmative because of the fact that we're telling you there'd be more of a backlog if there's more COVID cases, because inherently if physicians prioritize people that have COVID over other illnesses, that means that when you have more COVID cases, then physicians won't prioritize people that are pregnant or people that have other things even worse, because again, that's just how like it works within China. Thank you. For these reasons, we negate.
The number 2 short circuit.
Okay, so off-time roadmap is going to be an overview and then going into impact analysis. My time starts now. The negation is going to be winning today's debate because we are the only side that falls for the 10% of unvaccinated population in China, securing more access to healthcare for people in rural areas living in poverty in the long term. And we're going to be proving to you today why lives should outweigh the economy. So let's go to the first impact of lives. First, the affirmative concedes that vaccination is key to solving for mutations. They concede that mutations are not inevitable and can be solved, which means expanding healthcare access and infrastructure under the zero COVID-19 policy is the only way we can actually solve for vaccinations in the long term under the negation world. First reason for this is because we're going to be continuously allocating resources effectively and efficiently to areas. The affirmation frames this as diversion from resources, but we think this is allocation of resources to the places that need it the most. In the affirmative world, they're all going to be concentrated in one area and they're not going to continue to spread. But if we continue to track these lockdowns and force these isolations, we're going to be able to know which places actually need it the most. Therefore, allowing these healthcare workers, allowing these medical online institutes and lockdowns to kind of go to the rural areas, go to people in poverty and save those lives who are already at higher risk of like developing COVID or more vulnerable to COVID right now. We also increase funding directly, which is better than the like indirect increase in revenues like city government, because of the fact that when we increase infrastructure in that area, the government gets more like funding for employees. Employees also spend more money when they're hired as healthcare workers, so that also contributes back to the economy. Okay, second response that you should extend from my partner is that you have to track these people in order to increase the amount of vaccinations. Without tracking these people, you don't know who needs to be vaccinated. You can't really enforce that vaccination either, which means vaccination is the only way to solve for mutations in the long run. And they also concede how this infrastructure and vaccinations are key to other diseases in the long term, which means we're going to be winning on time frame because of the fact that in the long term, we're going to be saving countless lives with the diseases like tuberculosis, like the flu, and also solving for the economy, because they also concede how the economy can still reopen in the long term if zero COVID is continued right now, right? We're saying that it's necessary to continue it right now and it's beneficial right now since the job is not done. We can end zero COVID like maybe 5 to 10 years down the line, but the job is not done right now. Okay, so in addition, we tell you how lives is the internal link to economy and access to healthcare. If we increase the amount of cases and we increase the spread of COVID-19, that's going to worsen the amount of backlog that's in these hospitals. It probably means that without infrastructure, people can't even get to the hospital in the first place. They're just going to suffer with COVID by themselves, and they're not going to be able to get access. In addition, we say that healthcare is the internal to the economy, because when we increase infrastructure, when we increase the amount of like PPE, the healthcare industry is a key part of the economy, so that's going to contribute more first. But also, when we increase the amount of healthcare workers, that's going to increase consumer spending as well by increasing the amount of employees there. In addition, we say extend to my partner's analysis about how if people are sick, they're not going to be able to like go to work. They're not going to be able to focus on anything. So that's going to be really bad. Okay, but now let's go into the second point of conflict, which is economy. First, extend all of our reviews about how the majority of China's economy is already online, so we can see that the impact of the economy is already going to be significantly mitigated. We can also see that China's economy literally grew 8.1% during the COVID-19 pandemic, which shows that businesses are not moving. They're still continuing to export, hiring people on site and continuing production. Like again, extend the facts about how even if we're losing jobs in the short term, the long term outweighs, because of the fact that the faster we can end the pandemic, the faster we can get 100% of the 1 billion people in China to be vaccinated, the faster we can reopen the economy and reap all these better economic benefits in the long term. And because for all these reasons, we're going to be winning on the high magnitude impact of that 10%, 1 million additional people being vaccinated, and the increase in infrastructure that solves for the backlog. In the future, we strongly urge an affirmation ballot because lives are irreversible and the economy is not. Thank you.
Okay, fun. It's going to be the last speech for the affirmative. It's going to be a lot of big picture stuff. So if you want to flow this, I'd probably suggest a new sheet, or you could just flow it on the affirmative. That would work too. Okay, but yeah, it's generally going to be like aff, then neg, I suppose, and weighing will be interspersed. Okay, 5 minutes. Is anybody not ready?
No, we're good.
Sounds good. My time will begin now. This round isn't a question of what zero COVID has done in the past, but rather what it's going to do for the world right now. At the end of the day, we're debating a world in where COVID is inevitable. COVID is increasingly transmissible. COVID keeps mutating, and it's expected that COVID will become like the flu. Unfortunately, in a world where COVID is here to stay, zero COVID is not a viable policy that can stay with it. The biggest reason you're voting affirmative in today's debate is because zero COVID simply isn't feasible. Zero COVID means that we shut down cities, the economy, daily life, reallocate every single health resource when a single case comes up. Zero COVID means zero cases. Zero cases just doesn't make sense for all of the reasons I mentioned above. The fact that mutations continue to arise, and even if you have vaccines to treat these mutations, they still infect more people. Omicron continues to infect more people. Extend the Hong Kong warrant. Maybe this isn't China if they want you to believe, like say that, but it still had a zero COVID policy. Despite their zero COVID policy, they had the highest number of cases in like 2020 plus 2021 combined because of Omicron. Right now is a uniquely specific time in which we see that the transmissibility of COVID is massively increasing. Unfortunately, even in situations where we have zero COVID, this means that people still get COVID. Those thousands of cases that are unprecedented in that region happened because COVID is just increasingly transmissible and it's here to stay. That means that zero COVID isn't doing what they say it will do. In the context of the modern world of Omicron and increased transmissibility, that means that zero COVID doesn't solve. What it does do is that means that at the drop of the hat, the economy shuts down and society shuts down. Even if this is a very devastating impact, because even if you buy that China grew relatively in the pandemic, Omicron shutdowns have destroyed their growth in comparison to the world now, to the worst rate of growth that China has had in 4 decades, and much worse than previous years, including 2020 and 2021, which indicates that right now, because of this specific instance of Omicron increased transmissibility, the economy is going to be uniquely harmed. The economy is going to go down, and people aren't going to be able to afford basic goods. This is the biggest impact in today's round. It impacts the most people on net because you can't eat food if you don't have money, if companies are closing, if jobs are ending, and the prices of food are going up. You cannot reopen the economy in what our opponents tell you 5 to 10 years and then down the line and expect everything to be okay. It's not okay at the point where people are going into poverty now and starving now. They tell you that lives matter. Well, we also have to care about the lives of the people who do not have enough food to eat, the malnutrition and the health of all of these people too. And even if you buy that a good public health leads to a good economy, they don't get access to that impact because they fundamentally fail to solve for health in the first place. But even more than that, we'd argue that a strong economy is critical to funding things like health infrastructure, because that's how you get these biotech companies to actually invest into the economy. That's how you get these the local and city governments that actually have the money to build back this health infrastructure when you have a flourishing economy. Now, they give you two reasons why zero COVID is a good idea: lives and infrastructure. On the contention of lives, recognize, Judge, that the affirmative today isn't defending a world where we stop caring about COVID. It's not defending that we have zero more lockdowns or zero isolations or zero contact tracing. It's simply defending a world in which we don't shut down absolutely everything because of one case. We don't kill health infrastructure. We don't end investment in COVID by any means. No, we don't. Just look to Taiwan as an example for this. We tell you that COVID investment will happen regardless. People will continue to care about COVID. It's just that we don't have to kill everything, kill the chance of having economic prospects because of a single case. Now, they tell you these ideas about how like vaccines are all contingent on COVID and that like the stopping the spread is contingent on zero COVID, but that's not true. Look to the US, Germany, Australia, all of these countries who have gotten their populations vaccinated. Mutations are inevitable, maybe, but we don't have to treat every single not serious case of COVID in order to save lives. Now on infrastructure, they tell you their contention just doesn't make sense for two reasons. First, infrastructure investment happens either way, as I mentioned above. But second, COVID reallocation is actually bad for infrastructure for two reasons. First is that sending workers away to the biggest outbreak means that the communities that are smaller never get treatment. That means that the outbreaks that are starting to develop, that are starting to break out, don't get contained before they spread, which means that ultimately they increase the transmissibility. But second is the idea of wait times, because under the zero COVID policy, they're required to admit every single COVID patient to a hospital. That massively increases wait times for ordinary people and for the people who have serious COVID cases as well. Because people who have serious COVID cases are going to be placed behind the people who maybe have less serious COVID cases, but still have to be admitted to a hospital and take up space. Now, the most probable thing that happens from acknowledging that zero COVID right now is a mistake is that we see that there is going to be a chance of China being able to actually combat COVID in a reasonable way, in a way that we don't have to shut down health infrastructure, we don't have to reallocate resources, we don't have to destroy the economy for a single chance that, oh, this one case might spread, when unfortunately that one case spreading is already inevitable. For all of those reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative vote.
Thank you, everyone. Good debate.
You guys, that was a lot of fun.
Okay, I just submitted and I was the last judge, so I think we're good to go.
All right, I'm happy to announce the result, and then we'll let the other judges give an RFD if they'd like to go first. Really good round, really competitive, lots of clash. It's a 2-1 decision for the Gov. Congrats.
Yep, so it looks like me and Kyle were the ones who voted for Gov, and Alex was the one who voted for the op. It was a very close round, so I'm not surprised by that. Do we know if we have all of the competitors here?
We're here.
Do we want to do the dissent first? Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think traditionally the squirrel always goes first. Yeah, it's so weird saying the squirrel. I've never understood that, but sure. Yeah. So I was the one judge that ended up voting for the op in this round. It was definitely a very close round, so I'm really curious to hear, obviously, Kyle and Isabella's decisions, because I think either way it was very close. Yeah. So I think for me, obviously, like, this round is obviously based on like what we, what does more good than harm. I think I ended up buying a couple of different things from opposition. I think really at the end of the day, for me, it kind of collapsed on this idea of what is more important, both short-term and long-term. Is it economy or is it health? Because at the end, I think both teams ended up weighing on this. I ended up buying opposition's analysis that economy does not matter, that the economy in China has relatively not been that bad compared to other countries. And I think that's the really big thing that for me makes a difference, is that opposition tells me this relative analysis. And I get this from a couple of places. First, I get this like turn against government's analysis on like, oh, like China has been shipping less, they've been doing less good, their economy is crumbling, mostly because first, they did point out that other countries are also similarly having a lot of problems with recessions, which brings me to this idea that this is not uniquely just a China problem, but more likely than not just a COVID like issue in general. Second, we also get this analysis that other people in other countries are also buying. I get this out of the MO, which also leads me to believe to this idea that, okay, since China is all about manufacturing / shipment / production, if other countries are buying less and shipments are occurring less in general, then comparatively, that gives me a rationale as to why China is not doing as great as it would be doing before. And a lot of like government's analysis is telling me that, oh, look, China right now in the status quo is doing a lot worse than it has over the past 40 years. This is a direct linkage into the zero COVID policy. Zero COVID policy is really bad for the economy. But then when opposition gives me all of these like other rationales as to why this is not a uniquely COVID, like a uniquely zero COVID issue alone, I don't necessarily buy all of the like impacting that government gives me then on why zero COVID policy is so uniquely bad for like the economy on its own. But furthermore, like I think the comparative analysis that China's economy is still doing relatively okay, even compared to other countries, based on like the fact that they're still growing and not like contracting. So even though China is not doing as great as it was doing, say, like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, it's still not like contracting. It's still not being wrecked, which leads me to believe that, China's economy overall right now, relative to other countries, which are seeing massive contractions and massive shockwaves, is probably not actually that terrible. That's the first thing I get. Okay. Then from there, kind of looking at health, I think that then there's kind of this issue of like, does a good economy lead to better health, and does it like work better for China in the long term, or is health going to be the most important thing in both the short term and the long term? Okay, so I think that first, like, I don't really count so much the whole like, oh, like millions of lives already been saved, because I do think this is looking at the right now. So obviously, if we were looking at this like a holistic, like zero COVID policy has just been like bad or good overall, I think I would have bought that from opposition. What I did end up buying from opposition, though, is that relative to what we've seen in the past, the fact that China has been able to like escape so many deaths with such a massive amount of population leads me to believe that in the future, they'll also probably likely to also like prevent millions of deaths. I also think the 10% unvaccinated statistic is pretty compelling, since we've seen that in other countries already, like even with like 70% like vaccination rates, you're still seeing massive like economic turmoil from contractions and then expansions and then contractions, expansions. And I feel like opposition sufficiently warrants that this is exactly what would happen in the long term, where you would get an economy that would recoil from like growing because COVID is decreasing to once again contracting severely because COVID's increasing. I think also the warranting that China is such a massive country that is extremely densely populated, especially along massive economic sectors, probably means that the contractions are going to be pretty severe. But furthermore, I also think that based on the characterization I get in this round, and I think this kind of in a way is a knife from the PMR tells me that, oh, look, and I think it's also in the MG. The PMR and the MG told me that, oh, we're not defending like obviously zero lockdowns. We're not defending like no actions being taken. But they do say, and I quote, there will still be lockdowns just in specific locations. Which then leads me to think, okay, if opposition is telling me that there will be like severe contractions if we just kind of let it go, plus this characterization from government that there will still be lockdowns and still be preventative measures, then what is to say that we won't just have lockdowns in cities that are like super big in manufacturing or port cities or major like sectors of industry, which would still, again, support the idea that your economy would be recoiling, contracting, expanding, contracting, expanding. I also think that, well, there's a bit more murky on like who actually went on rural communities. I do think that in a world where China just stops caring as much about COVID in general and starts going to like specific, like, you know, we care about like how many cases there are, trying to prevent it. I do think that to some extent, rural communities would probably be forgotten more just because they're not massive population centers and thus are not as likely to spread COVID. And I think uniquely only under a zero COVID policy does China really care so much about these smaller cities / more rural areas. So those are kind of the areas where I ended up like voting on the opposition, but it was definitely like a very close round. And I took like 15 minutes because I was having a really hard time just thinking of how to weigh everything or how to look at all of the weighing. So yeah, either way, really great round. It was awesome.
Yeah, completely agree. Kyle, would you mind if I go first? I think my RFD is going to be shorter than yours, probably. I'll turn on my camera for this. Oops, I haven't turned on all day, so don't know where it is. So again, I agree. The round was super close. I think it came down to temporality for me, and I think this was a huge issue in the round in general. Is when exactly to talk about this policy. I think neg sufficiently proves that like the policy probably was necessary in the past, but I think where Act 1 for me is whether or not I think the policy is necessary like in the recent future and or like in the recent past. And insofar as the resolution reads is, I think I'm looking at the recent past and soon future. And so I think why I chose F is because they probably win that the economy is worse with the policy, but neg wins that they probably save at least slightly more lives. I think neg is right that skilled workers probably aren't affected because they can work remote and that the healthcare industry probably benefits from this policy. However, I think that AF is right that there are some inefficiencies that occur because of a COVID-only focus within the healthcare industry. But I also think that neg is right that with more healthcare workers overall, this just helps lower income areas get more focused, which I think Alex also mentioned. I do think that low skilled workers is actually a lot of where I rested my decision. I think that low skilled workers are the ones that are most affected by the policy, which I think sufficiently proves. And because they are lower income workers, their quality of life probably will decrease from this policy continuing. I think that AF also wins that a full no COVID policy is probably impossible to achieve. I think at the end of the day, neg saves more lives because quarantine is probably somewhat effective, but AF proves that quality of life for the most vulnerable decreases. And I think that AF is right that relocation toward COVID isn't effective and as COVID becomes less severe, it's likely that China probably still will care about healthcare when the policy lifts. If I believe that the temporality here impacts the recent past and like the maybe 5 or 10 years down the line that neg says they might continue the policy, I think AF effectively weighs that the quality of life for people in China because of the effect on specifically vulnerable industries that require in-person work. I think that's probably more important than focusing on the fewer and fewer lives that will be saved by the policy over time. And so that's why I ended up choosing F. But yeah, it was a super great round.
So I also affirmed. I thought it was quite close. For me, I vote fairly similarly to Isabella, largely on issues of temporality. I think AF runs a really smart strategy in this round, and it gets a little bit lost in MG, but there is enough of it brought back in PMR that I'm comfortable voting off of a couple of, I think, pretty key pieces of like relatively nuanced and pretty well warranted offense on AF. So I hear this story at the top of the AF case that at a point in time, like for the first 12 to 18 months of COVID, a zero COVID policy made sense because transmissibility rates were not nearly as high as they are now. And so it actually was effective to like lock down and shut down an entire area for a single case. And B, there wasn't herd immunity and widespread like distribution of vaccines. There wasn't a lot of healthcare infrastructure set up. Like Isabella, I buy that it's a present tense question. I also buy this insofar as what OP just chooses to do strategically in this round. I think there's a really interesting shift between MO and LOR, and I would have been a lot more likely to vote OP in this round if the LO had framed the round in the same way that the MO did. What I largely hear on MO is a very like retrospective historical analysis that's like, you know, the way to think about this round is actually like what this policy did before. That's how you should be adjudicating. I think I get like pretty good warranting out of MO for like why that should happen. But then like all of LOR is forward looking, right? Like all of the arguments that I get out of LOR are about like what things happen in terms of like mitigating the future spread of disease, what sorts of things happen in building up and sustaining public health infrastructure, what sort of things happen in like building up the economy in the long term, and like all of the weighing here is done in the long term. So like insofar as like the op rebuttal is telling me to weigh the round like in the long term, I end up not really looking all that much at any sort of like op offense in this round that I think would be primarily historical in nature, if that makes sense. So I think Gov wins on two really key arguments. I think that Gov wins that insofar as like there are a lot of things that the Gov world still defends that aren't like total draconian shutdowns and lockdowns that happen on one case. Like Gov advocacy to me is like very aggressive management of COVID and mitigation of COVID. It's not like full stop, shut down, lock down everything. And so I think that Gov is able to co-opt a lot of like the things that opposition tells me that have been effective historically and will be effective in the future: widespread distribution of vaccines, online clinics, testing sites, isolation and quarantine, contact tracing, etc. What's missing for me is a unique warrant on opposition for like why those things are, why you uniquely need to do these like total shutdowns and lockdowns after one case in order for them to work. So insofar as I don't hear that analysis from op, I think Gov is able to access like pretty much all. I actually am like a little bit more confident, I think, than Isabella is, that Gov is able to like probably save like pretty close to the same amount of lives and get close to that. But even if there is like a little bit more severity in terms of health outcomes on Gov, I think that Gov pretty effectively wins this argument that one thing that's very unique to the zero COVID policy that I don't hear like an op refutation to is this idea that COVID cases and COVID treatments will be prioritized in hospitals over any other sort of like health problem. I don't know if that's like actually factually true. So like I voted on that as a tech judge, not a truth judge. But like insofar as I buy that, you know, COVID is probably not the most severe thing that people are going to be presenting with in China, and insofar as 90% of people are already vaccinated, like, I think that there's just a lot more harms overall in terms of health beyond COVID in a world in which a future zero COVID policy necessitates prioritizing a disease that is maybe a little bit more severe than the flu now, but is largely like constrained to 10-15% of the population over all sorts of other health harms. So I think Gov is ahead on that argument on health. And then I think most importantly, I think Gov is just ahead on the argument about the economy. I think there's really good like long-term weighing insofar as I buy that like the thing that uniquely throttles the economy right now and will continue to do it worse in the future is the act of like totalizing shutdowns and lockdowns. It's not contact tracing, it's not vaccines, it's not temporary quarantines or isolation, it's not prevention and like testing sites. Gov can access all of those. The thing that Gov tells me is that totalizing lockdowns and shutdowns are what will cause like China's economy to continue to lapse. Those impacts, like Isabella said, disproportionately fall on low and middle income workers who are in like in-person manufacturing jobs, et cetera. And so I think Gov is able to generate like a pretty decent amount of offense off of this while still accessing like a relatively equal level of positive benefits on health, in addition to some of the trade-off arguments that I mentioned. So voted Gov for those reasons. Look, phenomenal round, really close. Like there's a really, there are like a lot of compelling RFDs here, but just thought Gov eked it out.
Thank you and congratulations to our opponents.
Thank you. Thank you for the good round. Thank you, judges, for judging.
Good luck.